What if on your wedding night, a millionaire whispered, "Trust me, I'll go slow," and you, young and innocent, had to give him your heart? She was 22, he was 47. An arranged marriage born from desperation. But what happened next changed everything forever. Tell me, where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and drop a like for more stories that will take your breath away. In the half-light of the master bedroom, illuminated only by jasmine candles that perfumed the air with an almost suffocating sweetness, Emily felt Jack's rough fingers delicately touch her face. The touch, as soft as it was unexpected, awakened in her a shiver that ran from the nape of her neck to the tips of her toes. Her eyes, the color of freshly ground coffee, met his, dark and deep like wells that harbored secrets of bygone eras. "Trust me, I'll go slowly," he whispered, with a voice that sounded like an ancient promise, a pact sealed in the intimacy of their first night together. Emily, at 22, found herself surrendering not only her heart, but all the trust that one soul could offer another. Her white lace dress rested on a burgundy velvet armchair, a silent witness to a ceremony that had taken place just 6 hours earlier, so quickly that she barely had time to process it. He, at 47, possessed an incalculable fortune built on vineyards in Napa Valley, and eyes that seemed to contain entire storms. Sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most necessary destinations, she thought, as the bells of St. Patrick's Cathedral marked midnight, as if announcing the beginning of a story that neither had planned to star in. The 19th-century mansion, located in the Upper East Side, breathed history through every pore of its walls. From the intricate moldings to the ceilings with century-old wooden beams, everything spoke of times of splendor and secrets kept under layers of time. Emily, the daughter of a retired history professor, raised among worn books and chamomile tea in the humble Greenwich Village neighborhood, now found herself trembling not from fear, but from the intensity of that gaze that promised worlds she completely unknown to her. "I never imagined ending my wedding day in a place like this," she murmured, contemplating the frescoes on the ceiling that depicted mythological scenes of forbidden loves and eternal passions. "Life rarely takes us where we plan, but frequently leads us where we need to be," Jack replied as he lit a new candle, projecting dancing shadows on the walls of that room that seemed suspended between eras. The story of how they had arrived there seemed extracted from a Scott Fitzgerald novel, dramatic, improbable, and with a touch of American fatalism. A marriage arranged by desperate circumstances, she agreeing to save her father from certain death after a heart attack that required costly surgery. He seeking an heir before turning 50 to satisfy the eccentric will of his late father. But that night under the roof of that mansion that was now also her home, Emily felt for the first time that perhaps, just perhaps, what had begun as a cold notarial agreement could transform into something more. Something that neither she nor Jack dared yet to name. The first weeks in the mansion passed like a strange dance of shadows and silences. Emily and Jack moved through the wide corridors with the caution of two strangers forced to share too intimate a space. Breakfasts, served punctually at 7:30 on the veranda overlooking the interior garden, were exercises in tense courtesy. "Did you sleep well?" he would ask each morning, without raising his eyes from the financial newspaper he read, while drinking black coffee without sugar. "Yes, thank you," she would invariably reply, although she spent many nights awake, listening to the creaks of that old house, wondering what stories its walls might hold. Emily had learned in a short time that Jack awakened religiously at 5 in the morning, swam for an hour in the heated pool in the basement, and then locked himself in his office until noon. He was a man of inflexible routines, forged in the discipline of someone who had built an empire from scratch, despite having inherited the first vineyards from his father, an Italian immigrant who arrived in California with empty hands and a soul full of dreams. One Tuesday afternoon, as the golden light of New York began to fade behind the skyscrapers, Emily ventured for the first time into the immense library of the mansion. It was an imposing room, with mahogany shelves that ascended to the ceiling and a spiral staircase that allowed access to the highest volumes. The smell of old paper, aged leather and waxed wood, reminded her of the afternoons of her childhood in the New York Public Library, where her father would take her to feed the soul, as he used to say. As she ran her fingers over the spines of century-old editions of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Steinbeck, Emily felt a presence behind her. She turned, startled, to find Mrs. Sullivan, the elderly housekeeper, who had been in the service of the Morgan family for more than 3 decades. "Excuse me, ma'am, I didn't mean to startle you," said the woman with her marked Boston accent. "Mr. Morgan wants to know if you would like to accompany him tonight to a business dinner." Emily blinked in surprise. In almost a month of marriage, it was the first time Jack had invited her to participate in any aspect of his professional life. "Of course," she replied, trying to disguise her bewilderment. "Could you tell me where the dinner will be?" "At the Metropolitan Club, ma'am. Mr. Morgan says he'll pick you up at 8, and that you should wear something appropriate." The last word left Mrs. Sullivan's lips with a nuance that Emily couldn't quite interpret. That night, wrapped in a navy blue silk dress she had found hanging in her closet with a concise note, "For tonight, J." Emily faced New York high society for the first time. The Metropolitan Club, with its crystal chandeliers and its marble floors, was an intimidating setting for someone raised in the sobriety of a modest apartment in traditional Greenwich Village. The evaluating gazes of women adorned with pearls and diamonds, with their designer dresses and their impeccable hairstyles, pierced her like small pins. But what destabilized her most was discovering during dinner that Jack was wearing a wedding ring, different from the one they had exchanged in their hasty wedding. During dessert, while a string quartet interpreted Gershwin in a corner of the salon, Emily gathered the courage to ask, "Why are you wearing a different ring from the one I gave you?" Jack looked at her with an intensity that made the entire salon seem to vanish around them. For an instant, his mask of imperturbable businessman cracked, revealing something akin to pain. "There are questions, Emily, whose answers have a price. Are you sure you want to pay it?" The phrase floated between them, heavy as lead, marking the first real challenge in their strange relationship. Emily held his gaze, discovering in herself a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I think I'm already paying for answers I haven't even asked for," she finally responded, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. That night, on the journey back to the mansion, the silence inside the Mercedes was so dense it was almost palpable, and Emily understood that she had begun to crumble the first wall of many that Jack had built around himself. The discovery came as important truths often do, accidentally and when least expected. Emily had been looking for letter paper in the drawers of an antique desk in the library when her fingers stumbled upon a leather envelope. Curiosity, that primitive force that has moved humanity since its beginnings, impelled her to open it. Inside, she found photographs of a beautiful woman with wavy black hair and vivacious eyes. In all the images, she appeared next to a much younger Jack, perhaps around 35 years old, whose smile revealed a completely different person from the one who now shared a roof with her. In one of the photographs, the most worn by time, the woman held a small bundle wrapped in a blue blanket against her chest, while Jack looked at her with an adoration that Emily had never seen in his eyes. "Who is she?" Emily's voice came out in a whisper when that night during dinner she placed the photograph on the mahogany table. Jack's fork remained suspended halfway between his plate and his mouth. For an instant, it seemed that time froze in the dining room, decorated with American antiques and heavy crimson velvet curtains. "My first wife, Catherine," he finally answered, setting his cutlery on the linen tablecloth with excessive care. "She left me 10 years ago." The way he pronounced "left me" contained a specific weight, as if each syllable were loaded with a history much more complex than those simple words suggested. "And the baby?" Emily dared to ask, feeling she was entering mind territory. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, Emily had the impression of being in front of a man who had just received a physical blow. "She took my son with her. Michael was only 3 days old when they disappeared from my life." The confession fell between them like a tombstone. Suddenly, many things began to make sense. The closed room on the 3rd floor that Emily had noticed but never mentioned, the way Jack avoided any conversation about family during dinners, the looks of compassion that Mrs. Sullivan directed at her boss when she thought no one was watching. "I'm so sorry," Emily said with sincerity, instinctively extending her hand across the table to touch his. Jack withdrew his, as if the contact burned him. "I don't need your compassion," he responded, with a coldness that violently contrasted with the vulnerability he had shown seconds before. "I need you to respect the boundaries I've established in this house. There are rooms you should not enter, and questions you should not ask." He rose abruptly, throwing his napkin on the table. "This marriage has a practical purpose for both of us. Let's not complicate it with unnecessary sentimentality." Emily remained alone in the dining room, listening as Jack's steps moved away down the corridor and then up the main staircase. The echo of each footfall seemed to mark the rhythm of a truth that was beginning to reveal itself. She wasn't simply married to an older, wealthy man. She was bound to someone whose heart seemed as hermetically sealed as the century-old cellars of his vineyards in Napa Valley. That night, as she contemplated from her window the full moon that bathed the Manhattan skyline in silver, Emily made a decision. If she was going to live in that golden cage, she would at least discover what ghosts inhabited it along with her. Life in the mansion had acquired a certain routine that, while it couldn't be called comfortable, at least was predictable. Emily had begun to fill her days exploring New York as she had never been able to before. She visited exhibitions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, strolled through Central Park as evening began to fall, and New Yorkers came out to enjoy the fresh air, and had even enrolled in painting classes at a small studio in Soho. Painting, a hobby she had cultivated since childhood with humble materials, had become her refuge. Jack, surprisingly, had prepared for her a luminous studio in one of the unoccupied rooms of the mansion, providing her with materials she could never have afforded: first-quality canvases, pigments imported from Europe, and sable brushes that cost more than the monthly rent of the apartment where she had grown up. It was precisely upon returning from one of her classes that she found it, a letter without a return address that someone had slipped under the main door. The envelope of cream-colored paper with a thick texture simply bore her name written in an elegant angular calligraphy. A subtle aroma of lavender emanated from it. Emily opened it as she climbed the stairs to her room, stopping midway when her eyes caught the first lines. "He will never love you as he loved the first. You are just a pale substitute, a tool to keep the money in the family. Discover what happened on the third floor before surrendering your heart completely." Her hands trembled, and she had to lean against the cold stone wall to maintain her balance. The staircase, with its marble steps worn by generations of footfalls, suddenly seemed a threatening space, as if the old portraits of unknown ancestors were observing her with malice from their gilded frames. Who could have written such a thing? And why did it specifically mention the third floor, that level of the mansion that Jack seemed to avoid completely? That night, during dinner, she observed her husband with new eyes. Jack ate in silence, as was his custom, concentrated on cutting each piece of meat meticulously, following some invisible pattern that only he knew. From time to time he would take his hand to his right temple, pressing lightly, a gesture that Emily had learned to interpret as a sign of his frequent migraines. "Are you all right?" she asked, breaking the habitual silence. Jack raised his gaze, surprised by the question. For an instant he seemed vulnerable, almost human. "Just tired," he answered dryly. "The new American regulations on wine exportation are complicating sales in the European market." Emily nodded, not knowing what else to add. But then, impelled by a courage she didn't even know she possessed, she ventured to ask, "What's on the third floor?" Jack's fork remained suspended halfway, and his expression transformed as if a blind had been suddenly lowered. "Why do you ask that?" His voice sounded controlled, too controlled. Emily hesitated. Mentioning the anonymous letter could generate more questions, more complications. Something inside her warned that it wasn't the right moment. "Simple curiosity," she lied. "I've explored almost the entire mansion, but I never go up there." "And you shouldn't," he replied with unusual harshness. "There are parts of my life that are not open to discussion, Emily. I thought we had made that clear." The rest of the dinner passed in an even denser silence than usual. When they finished dessert, Jack stood without looking at her. "Tomorrow I leave for Napa Valley. I'll be gone 3 days supervising the early harvest." And without further explanations, he abandoned the dining room, leaving Emily with the certainty that the anonymous letter, whoever had written it, contained at least a part of the truth. There were secrets buried in that house that Jack fiercely protected. That night, lying in her canopied bed while listening to the rain beat against the windows, Emily made a decision that would irrevocably change the course of her strange marriage. As soon as Jack left for Napa Valley, she would discover what was hidden on the third floor of the mansion. "There are truths that hurt more than lies," she thought as sleep began to overcome her, "but at least truths allow us to build on firm ground." The morning Jack departed for Napa Valley dawned covered by a thick fog that enveloped New York like a grey shroud. Emily observed from the window of her room how the black Mercedes disappeared through the forged gates of the mansion, taking with it the imposing presence of her husband. Only then, with the house suddenly empty of his silent authority, did she feel she could breathe fully. She waited until the service staff was busy with their morning tasks. Mrs. Sullivan supervised the cleaning of the East Wing, and Johnson, the gardener with knotty hands and a scarce smile, pruned the century-old rose bushes in the garden. It was the perfect moment. The staircase that led to the third floor was narrower than the main ones, as if it had been designed to be discreet, to not draw attention. Each wooden step creaked slightly under her feet, like small warnings. Upon reaching the upper landing, Emily found herself facing a corridor carpeted in pale blue that extended to a single door at the end. The light that entered through a stained glass window projected ghostly figures on the walls, lined with a motif of clouds and birds in flight. Everything in that space seemed designed for a child, for the son who never got to grow up in that house. With her heart beating so hard that she could hear it in her ears, Emily approached the door. It was locked, as she had assumed, but she remembered having seen a bunch of old keys in a drawer in the kitchen. After quickly going down and returning with them, she tried one after another until a soft click indicated she had found the right one. The door opened with a slight groan, as if protesting being disturbed after so long. The smell that escaped from the room was a mixture of candle wax, dried lavender, and that indescribable aroma of time standing still. What she saw left her breathless. It was a perfectly preserved nursery, like a time capsule frozen at the exact moment it was supposed to be occupied. A ceiling painted with clouds and stars that seemed to move in the filtered light. A white wooden crib with a crystal mobile that reflected small rainbows on the walls. Shelves filled with children's books, many still with the original wrapping plastic. Stuffed animals arranged in meticulous order, tags hanging from some, never embraced. And presiding over everything on the main wall, a hand-embroidered picture with a date from 10 years ago, and an inscription that made her heart tighten. Awaited with infinite love. Michael. Emily advanced slowly through the room, feeling that she was profaning a sanctuary. On a light wooden dresser, she found more photographs. Catherine pregnant, radiant, with Jack embracing her from behind, both smiling at the camera with that carefree happiness that only those who believe the future will be as luminous as their present possess. She opened the drawers carefully, baby clothes folded with almost obsessive precision, small socks that never warmed feet, hand-knitted caps that never protected a newborn head from the cold. She sat in the rocking chair next to the window, overwhelmed by what she was discovering. It wasn't just that Jack had lost his wife and son, it was that he had preserved intact the hope of their return, as if time had not passed at all. "You shouldn't be here." Mrs. Sullivan's voice startled her. The elderly housekeeper stood in the doorway, her face furrowed with wrinkles showing not anger, but infinite sadness. "Mrs. Sullivan, Emily began, but couldn't find the words to justify her intrusion. "This room is closed for a reason," said the woman, entering slowly. "The master hasn't allowed anyone to touch it in 10 years, not even to clean the dust." Emily looked around, noticing then that, indeed, a fine layer of time covered each surface. "What really happened, Mrs. Sullivan?" she asked, knowing that perhaps this was her only opportunity to know the truth. "Jack only told me that she left taking their son." Mrs. Sullivan sighed deeply, like someone who has carried a weight for too long. "Mrs. Catherine didn't abandon Mr. Morgan as everyone believes," she finally said, sitting on a small stool next to the crib. "She left because she discovered he had hidden the truth from her, a very important truth." Emily listened, immobile, as Mrs. Sullivan related how Jack, during the worst years of the economic crisis, had hidden from Catherine that the family business was on the brink of bankruptcy. He worked 18 hours a day, not out of ambition, as she believed, but out of desperation, trying to save the legacy of generations. When the mistress discovered the magnitude of the debts and the stress he had been hiding, she was in the 8th month of pregnancy, Mrs. Sullivan continued. She felt betrayed. She believed her marriage was built on lies. She went to her sister's house in Boston, but the distress brought on the labor early. Mrs. Sullivan's voice broke slightly. 3 days later, they called from Mount Sinai Hospital. The baby had been born prematurely, The master rushed there immediately, but when he arrived, Mrs. Catherine had already been discharged and had taken the little one. She disappeared without a trace. Some say she went to Europe, others that she went to Canada. No one knows for certain. Emily felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to fit. Jack's obsession with control, his fear of intimacy, his inability to trust. And he never tried to find them. The question hung in the air as Mrs. Sullivan stood up with difficulty. "Every day for 10 years, the elderly woman answered, heading to the door. "He has detectives in half the world, but not a trace of them. It's as if the earth had swallowed them." Before leaving, Mrs. Sullivan stopped and looked at Emily with an intensity that pierced her. "The master isn't a bad man, Mrs. Morgan. He's just someone who has lost too much and doesn't know how to trust again. Please leave everything as you found it, and leave here before someone else sees you." When Emily returned to her room, the anonymous letter still lay on her bed like a silent accusation. Now she better understood its meaning, but she also understood something deeper. Jack wasn't the cold, calculating man he appeared to be. He was a broken man, trying to hold together the pieces of himself with the only tool he knew: absolute control. During the following weeks, something began to change between them. It wasn't an abrupt or dramatic change, but rather like the gradual awakening of the earth after a too long winter. Small shoots of life appearing where before there was only ice. Emily had begun to spend more time in her painting studio. The New York light, so special in autumn, poured in through the windows and transformed the space into a sanctuary of creativity. There, with hands stained by oil paint and an increasingly lighter soul, she gave form to landscapes of the California coast and abstract portraits that tried to capture not so much the physical features as the emotional essence of her subjects. It was Jack who broke the established pattern. One afternoon, without announcing himself, he appeared in the doorway of the studio. Emily was so concentrated on the canvas she was working on that she didn't feel him arrive. When she finally perceived his presence, she startled, spilling turpentine on the wooden floor. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," he said, with an unusually soft voice. Emily hurried to clean the liquid with a cloth. "It's nothing. I was absorbed." Jack advanced slowly through the studio, observing the works arranged against the walls. He stopped in front of a particularly large canvas, an abstract interpretation of a man carrying an entire house on his shoulders, but with a garden of orange trees blooming amidst the burden. "This is—" he began, but interrupted himself, as if the words had evaporated. "It's what I see when I look at you," Emily replied with an honesty that surprised even herself. "Someone carrying an enormous weight, but who still manages to make something beautiful bloom." Jack remained motionless in front of the painting for what seemed like an eternity. When he finally turned towards her, there was a vulnerability in his eyes that Emily had never seen. "You have real talent," he said, and in his voice there was genuine amazement. "Not just technique, but vision. You see beyond the evident." This small exchange marked a turning point. In the following days, Jack began to dine earlier to be able to share the table with her. During these dinners, little by little, he started to open up. He told her about his travels through Latin America during his youth, when he fled the rigidity of America during the Reagan years. He shared anecdotes about his parents, Italian immigrants who came to Napa Valley with nothing and built a small empire through brutal work. "My father used to say that wine is like life," he shared one night as they savored a Cabernet Sauvignon that he himself had selected from the cellar. "It needs time, patience, and the ability to withstand storms to reach its best version." Emily listened, fascinated by these fragments of the man who had remained hidden behind the facade of the relentless businessman. And at some point, without realizing it, she began to respond with fragments of her own history. Her childhood in the modest apartment in Greenwich Village, the afternoons at the New York Public Library with her father, her youthful dreams of studying fine arts truncated by lack of resources. One night, as they contemplated the stars from the terrace scented with jasmine, Jack asked her the question that had been floating between them for weeks. "Why did you agree to marry me, Emily? And don't tell me it was just for your father's operation. You could have found another solution." The question caught her off guard. She took her time to respond, listening to the soft murmur of the fountain and the distant rumble of traffic on Fifth Avenue. "I suppose I saw something in your eyes when you offered to pay for my father's operation, without asking for anything in return, she finally answered. A loneliness that I recognized because it was the same one I felt. And then when you proposed this arrangement, I thought that perhaps two solitudes together might be less lonely. Jack remained silent for so long that Emily feared she had said too much, had crossed one of the invisible red lines that he constantly drew around himself. My proposal wasn't completely honest, he finally said. Emily felt her heart accelerate. What new revelation would come now? I had seen you before, he continued, looking at the starry sky. Several times at the New York Public Library, where you volunteered reading to the elderly. I was struck by your kindness, the way you treated each person with the same dignity, from the homeless in Washington Square to the tie-wearing executives. Emily looked at him astonished. Jack had observed her for months without her knowing. The coincidence at the hospital wasn't one, he confessed, not daring to look at her. I knew your father was ill. I knew you needed money for the operation. My father's will is real. I need an heir before turning 50, but I could have found other solutions. Why me? Was all Emily managed to articulate. Jack finally turned his face to her, and in his eyes was a mixture of shame and something deeper, something Emily didn't dare to name. Because I didn't believe someone like you could choose me freely. Not with the age difference, not with the emotional scars I carry, not with a disappeared son whom I still discreetly search for across the world. The confession floated between them, as fragile and precious as a soap bubble in the New York night air, and Emily understood that they were at a crossroads. They could retreat to the safety of their respective walls and continue with the marriage of convenience, or they could take a step forward towards unknown and dangerous territory. With a gesture that required more courage than she had ever needed, Emily extended her hand across the wrought-iron table and gently placed it on Jack's. This time, he didn't withdraw it. Sarah Morgan's visit from Los Angeles fell like a bomb on the fragile peace that was beginning to establish itself in the mansion. Jack's younger sister arrived unannounced on a Thursday afternoon when New York was recovering from an autumn storm that had cleared the sky, leaving it an impossible blue. Emily met her when Mrs. Sullivan showed her into the main salon, where she was reading by one of the windows. Sarah Morgan was a woman in her 40s with the same aristocratic bearing as Jack, but with sharper eyes and a calculated smile. She wore a Chanel suit and discreet but clearly valuable jewelry. "So you're the young woman who has achieved what no other has since Catherine," she said by way of greeting, evaluating her from head to toe as if examining merchandise. "Marrying my brother." Her tone distilled a mixture of condescension and malicious curiosity that immediately put Emily on guard. "I'm Emily Wilson, yes," she responded, rising to shake the hand that Sarah hadn't offered. "You must be Sarah. Jack has told me about you." A pious lie. Jack had barely mentioned his sister, except to explain that she lived in Los Angeles and that they maintained a distant relationship since the death of their parents. "I doubt my brother has told you much about me," Sarah replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Jack has always been selective with his confidences." The tension in the environment was palpable when Jack returned from the New York winery, where he had been supervising a wine shipment for export. His face, habitually impassive, showed genuine surprise at finding his sister comfortably installed in the salon. "Sarah, I didn't know you were coming." "Evidently," she responded, rising to kiss him on both cheeks, with a familiarity that contrasted with his rigidity. "But when I learned of your sudden marriage, I felt I should personally meet my new sister-in-law." Dinner that night was an exercise in barely contained tension. As they savored a prime rib prepared by Mrs. Sullivan, Sarah began to ask increasingly incisive questions about Emily's true motives for accepting the marriage. "It must be comforting to go from a modest apartment in Greenwich Village to a mansion on the Upper East Side," she commented with false sweetness as she cut a piece of bread. "A veritable modern fairy tale." Emily maintained her composure, responding with politeness, but without allowing herself to be intimidated. "Certainly it's a change," she conceded, "although sometimes I miss the simplicity of my previous life." "Of course," smiled Sarah, "though I imagine the bank accounts compensate for any nostalgia, don't they?" Jack intervened then, with a harshness that surprised both women. "Enough, Sarah. I won't allow you to insult my wife at our own table." Sarah appeared momentarily disconcerted by her brother's firmness, but recovered quickly. "I'm only trying to protect you, Jack. She wouldn't be the first woman who sees in you only your fortune. The metallic sound of cutlery against fine china seemed amplified in the tense silence that followed. As you did with Catherine, right? Jack asked, and his voice sounded dangerously controlled. You also protected her from me, telling her about the economic difficulties of the company in such a selective way that she was led to believe I'd been deliberately lying to her. Emily observed the exchange, suddenly realizing that she was witnessing the continuation of an old family battle. Catherine was too fragile for this world, Sarah responded without being perturbed. She needed to know the truth about your financial situation. It wasn't my fault that she decided to flee like a coward, taking your son. The accusation was so cruel that Emily felt she couldn't breathe. Jack rose abruptly, his face a mask of contained fury. Get out of my house, Sarah, now. Oh, come on, Jack. Sarah didn't move from her chair. I'm just being realistic. Your new wife should know what family she's gotten into. One where women flee taking the heirs, right? Though I suspect that's not Emily's intention. She seems more the type who patiently waits for the right moment to request a divorce and claim her part of the pie. The insinuation was so unfair, so distant from the truth of her growing feelings for Jack, that Emily felt something breaking inside her. Without a word, she rose from the table and left the dining room, tears burning in her eyes as she headed to the small terrace where a fountain sang softly under the moonlight. The fresh night air of New York slightly relieved the burning in her face. She sat on the edge of the fountain, letting the sound of the water drown out the tumultuous thoughts spinning in her mind. She didn't hear the approaching footsteps until Jack spoke, startling her. I've asked Sarah to leave, he said, his voice softer than Emily had ever heard it. She'll stay at a hotel tonight and return to Los Angeles tomorrow. Emily nodded without looking at him, fearing the tears would return if she met his eyes. I'm sorry you had to witness that, he continued, sitting beside her on the stone edge of the fountain. My sister and I, we have a complicated relationship. She thinks I'm only with you for money, murmured Emily. Sarah sees the world through the prism of her own motivations, Jack responded. She has lived her entire life in the shadow of an important surname, receiving a monthly allowance without ever working. She can't conceive that someone might have nobler motives. A silence settled between them, but for the first time, it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was more like a shared respite, a moment of truce. Is what she said true? Emily finally asked. About her telling Catherine about the economic problems? Jack sighed deeply, as if the weight of the years materialized in that sigh. Yes, at the worst possible moment, when Catherine was in her 8th month, vulnerable and worried about the baby's future. Sarah told her not only the truth, but a distorted version of it, that I had been deliberately hiding information from her, that we were on the brink of ruin, that I had even mortgaged the house where we would live with our son. Emily listened, beginning to understand the magnitude of the damage Sarah had caused. And why did she do it? Jack remained silent for so long that Emily thought he wouldn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded tired, as if the question had extracted the last reserves of his energy. My father always favored Sarah. She was his darling girl, his princess. But in his will, he made it clear that I would inherit total control of the wineries. Sarah would receive a generous allowance, but never decision-making power over the family business. So I think she never forgave us, him for the decision, me for benefiting from it. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit in Emily's mind. The anonymous letter with its elegant calligraphy and lavender aroma, the poisonous insinuations, the knowledge of details that only someone close to the family could know. It was her who sent me the letter, wasn't it? She asked, though she already knew the answer. The anonymous letter warning me about you. Jack turned to her, surprised and confused. What letter? Emily explained to him about the message she had received weeks earlier, the warning about the 3rd floor, the insinuations about being a pale substitute for Catherine. Jack's expression darkened as he listened, and when Emily finished, his voice sounded dangerously controlled. Typical of Sarah. Sowing doubts, creating fractures, manipulating others to get what she wants. And what does she want now? Jack looked at her directly, and in his eyes Emily saw a mixture of sadness and determination that oppressed her heart. The same as always. To weaken me. If my marriage fails, if I don't have an heir before turning 50, A clause in my father's will stipulates that 40% of the company shares would pass to her. Not total control, but enough to interfere in every decision I make." Emily processed this information, feeling a new perspective opening before her. All this time she had assumed that Jack had sought her out of convenience to fulfill a testamentary clause. Now she understood that it had also been to protect himself from his own sister, from the woman who had already destroyed his family once. "What are we going to do?" she asked, surprising herself by including herself in the equation. Jack seemed equally surprised by the "we," and something in his expression softened. "I don't know," he admitted, in a rare moment of vulnerability. "But for the first time in a long time, I feel that I'm not facing this alone." Driven by a courage she didn't know she possessed, Emily took Jack's hand in hers. "You're not," she affirmed with a conviction that was born from the deepest part of her being. "You're not." The discovery that Sarah had been the one who sent the anonymous letter represented a turning point in the relationship between Emily and Jack. Confronted with evidence that the private investigators Jack had hired found, Sarah finally confessed, with the resentment typical of old family rivalries, that she had always felt her brother had everything while she struggled with gambling debts accumulated in the casinos of Las Vegas. After Sarah's forced departure, a new dynamic began to establish itself in the mansion. Jack started to include Emily in aspects of his life that he had previously jealously kept separate. He invited her to business meetings, solicited her opinion on business decisions, even took her to the vineyards in Napa Valley so she could get to know what he called the heart of everything. It was during this visit to the wineries that Emily really began to understand Jack. She saw how he transformed among the vineyards. His face relaxed, his gestures became more fluid. He spoke with the workers, in a tone he never used in New York. There he wasn't the relentless businessman, but the son of Italian immigrants who had grown up among these vines, learning from his father every secret of the Red Earth. "This vineyard," he explained to her one afternoon, as they walked between rows of Merlot grapes ripening under the California sun, "was planted by my father with his own hands when I was 5 years old. He arrived from Italy with nothing, just with my mother and the will to work until he dropped each night." Emily listened, fascinated by these fragments of family history that Jack had never shared. "How did he manage to go from immigrant worker to owner of all this?" Jack smiled, a nostalgic smile that lit up his eyes. "With a combination of brutal work, natural intelligence, and some luck. He started as a laborer in these same fields, but quickly the owner then, Mr. August Winters, noticed that my father had a special gift for understanding the land, for predicting exactly when to harvest. Little by little he rose, from laborer to foreman, from foreman to general manager. When Mr. Winters fell ill without heirs, he offered my father the opportunity to buy the wineries at a price that, while still astronomical for us, was below the real value." "And how did he manage to raise the money?" Jack's face darkened slightly. "By mortgaging every last inch of land we had managed to buy in St. Helena, selling the family jewels my mother had brought when emigrating, working double shifts at other wineries, and accepting a silent partner who contributed the rest." "A partner?" "Martin," Jack nodded. "Edward Martin, a Wall Street investor who saw potential in the business. For years he was a blessing, but when the 2008 crisis hit, he began to pressure us to sell the wineries to a French multinational. That's when the problems with Catherine began." He stopped next to an old twisted vine, caressing its leaves with a tenderness Emily had never seen him show to any living being. "These vines are like people, you know. The oldest ones, those that have survived frosts, droughts, and plagues, are the ones that produce the most complex wine, with more character, but they are also the most vulnerable to certain types of pressure." Emily understood he wasn't just talking about plants. "What exactly happened with Catherine?" she dared to ask, knowing they were treading on delicate ground. Jack breathed deeply before responding, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to descend, tinting the fields orange. "I hid from her the magnitude of the financial problems, not to deceive her, but to protect her. She was pregnant, excited about our future, decorating the baby's room. But Sarah, who has always had a special talent for the precise moment, chose the 32nd week of the pregnancy to tell Catherine not only that we were in difficulties, but that I had been deliberately lying for years, that I was a manipulator who had kept her in a bubble of false security. Catherine, with her hormones altered by the pregnancy, and genuinely frightened for the future of our son, interpreted it as an unforgivable betrayal. Emily remained silent, letting Jack continue, at his own pace. I didn't want to burden her with the anguish of knowing we could lose everything, that the banks were threatening to foreclose on mortgages, that Martin was pressuring more each day. He paused, his voice becoming graver. She went to Boston, to her sister's house. I tried to explain to her, to ask for forgiveness, but she refused to speak to me. 3 days later, they called from Mount Sinai Hospital. The baby had been born prematurely. I drove like a madman to New York, but when I arrived, both Catherine and the child had been discharged and had disappeared. She left a note. I will not let my son grow up in a family built on lies. He pronounced the last phrase with such raw pain that Emily felt her heart constrict. And you never heard anything about them? Nothing, he responded, with a bitterness that seemed to permeate the air around them. It's as if the earth had swallowed them. I've hired detectives, searched records in half the world, contacted every relative and friend Catherine had. No one knows anything, or at least that's what they say. They began to walk back to the manor house that dominated the vineyards. The setting sun projected their elongated shadows on the red earth, merging them into a shared silhouette. And the room on the 3rd floor? Emily asked softly. Jack took time to respond, as if searching for the exact words. At first, keeping it intact was a form of hope. I believed that sooner or later Catherine would reconsider, that she would return with our son, and they would occupy that room that we had prepared with so much love. As the years passed, it became a kind of sanctuary, a reminder of everything I lost by not being completely honest with the person I loved. He stopped and looked directly at Emily, with an intensity that made her hold her breath. That's why I've never lied to you, Emily. I may not have told you the whole truth from the beginning, but I've never told you a direct lie. I couldn't bear to make the same mistake twice. Something in the way he said it, in the naked vulnerability of his confession, touched Emily deeply. Impulsively, she took his hand. Thank you for trusting me, she said simply. Jack intertwined his fingers with hers, and they continued walking in a complicit silence as the sun finished setting behind the hills of Napa Valley, tinting the sky an intense purple that would soon give way to the starry night. That night, in the old stone house that dominated the vineyards, they slept in the same room for the first time. There was no unbridled passion or grandiose declarations, just the silent comfort of two people who were beginning to tear down, stone by stone, the walls that separated them. The New York autumn was tinting the trees in Central Park with ochres and golds when Emily made a decision that both frightened and excited her. She would organize an exhibition of her paintings. Not in a large gallery in the Upper East Side, where the Morgan surname would automatically open doors, but in a small alternative space in Soho, using a pseudonym so that her work would be judged on its own merits. For weeks, she worked feverishly in her studio, taking advantage of the hours when Jack was in the office to put the finishing touches on the works she had selected. They were canvases that reflected her emotional evolution during the past year, from the first ones, dominated by cold tones and hermetically closed compositions, to the more recent ones, where warm colors began to make their way among the shadows, like rays of sun breaking through storm clouds. She hadn't told Jack about the exhibition, not out of distrust, but because she needed to do this for herself, to prove that she could build something of her own beyond the surname she now bore and the fortune to which she had access. The night of the opening arrived wrapped in a soft drizzle that made the cobblestones of the narrow streets of Soho shine. The gallery, a converted old workshop, quickly filled with young artists, fine art students, and curious neighbors who sipped cheap red wine and nibbled olives as they contemplated the paintings displayed under directional spotlights. Emily, dressed with studied simplicity, jeans, a white shirt, and a red shawl that had belonged to her mother, mingled among the attendees without revealing she was the artist. She listened to comments, absorbed reactions, experienced for the first time the emotion of seeing her work judged by strangers who had no idea who she really was. It was then that she saw him. Jack was standing in front of one of her most personal paintings, that abstract portrait of the man carrying a house on his back, but with orange trees flowering on his shoulders. He wore a dark suit that contrasted with the bohemian environment of the gallery, but there was something in his posture, in the reverent way he contemplated the work, that perfectly integrated him into the space. Emily froze. How had he discovered the exhibition? Who had told him that she was Laura Vega, the pseudonym she had chosen? As if feeling her gaze, Jack turned his face and located her among the crowd. Their eyes met across the gallery, and Emily saw something she had never seen in them. Pride. A pride so pure, so devoid of conditions, that she felt something melting inside her. Jack approached slowly, dodging groups of people who conversed animatedly with glasses in their hands. When he reached her, he said nothing. He simply took her hand and squeezed it gently, a gesture more eloquent than any word. "How did you know?" she began. "Mrs. Sullivan found an invitation in your studio while cleaning," he responded with a slight smile. "She couldn't help but mention it to me. She was very proud of the mistress." Emily felt a warm blush rise to her cheeks. "I wanted to do it myself, without your name or your money influencing," she explained, fearing he might misinterpret her motives. "I know," he nodded. "And you've succeeded. I've heard the comments. They like your work for what it is, not for who you are." They toured the exhibition together, Jack studying each painting with genuine attention, asking questions about techniques and motivations that revealed a real interest in understanding her art. Emily explained to him in a low voice, surprised by the ease with which the conversation flowed, by how natural it felt to share with him this most intimate part of herself. They stopped before a particularly impactful canvas, an interpretation of the mansion seen from outside, with all the windows illuminated except one, that of the third floor, which remained in shadows. "This is—" Jack didn't finish the phrase, but his voice had tensed slightly. "It's how I see our house," Emily replied softly. "Full of light, but with spaces that still remain in shadow. It's not a criticism, Jack. It's an observation." He nodded slowly, absorbing the meaning of her words. "You're right," he admitted. "There are spaces in my life, in our house, that I've kept in darkness for too long." A silence loaded with meaning settled between them, but it was interrupted by a young man with a bohemian appearance who approached with enthusiasm. "Are you Laura Vega?" he asked, addressing Emily. "I'm Julian Montes, from Urban Art magazine. I'd love to do an interview about your work." Emily exchanged a quick glance with Jack, who nodded almost imperceptibly, giving her space for this moment. "Yes, I'm Laura," she responded with a smile. "It would be my pleasure." While Emily conversed with the journalist, Jack discreetly moved away, giving her moment in the spotlight. She observed him move among the attendees, stopping occasionally in front of some painting, always inevitably returning to the portrait of the man with the house on his back. When the interview ended, Emily looked for him in the crowd, but couldn't find him anywhere. A pang of disappointment went through her, thinking he had left without saying goodbye. But then Martha, the gallery owner, approached with a glass of champagne. "Your husband has just done something extraordinary," she said to her in a low voice. "He bought your work, the entire collection." Emily looked at her in astonishment. "What? No, there must be a mistake. Jack wouldn't do—" "He did," Martha interrupted her with a smile, "but with a very specific condition, that it remain exhibited until the planned end of the show so that everyone can see it. And he insisted we not tell you, but I think you should know." Emily felt her eyes filling with tears. It wasn't the money that moved her. In fact, a part of her felt almost offended by the paternalistic gesture, but what it symbolized. Jack respected her art enough to want to preserve it complete, but also respected her need for public recognition by keeping it exhibited. When she returned to the mansion that night, she found him in the library, seated in a worn leather armchair next to the lit fireplace, with a glass of Scotch whiskey in his hand. Seeing her enter, he stood up. "You didn't have to buy my exhibition," Emily said without preambles. "I can accept failure if no one wants my paintings." "I didn't do it for that," he responded calmly. "I did it because I want to live surrounded by your vision of the world. Because when I look at your paintings, I see how you see me, how you see our house, our life, and that perspective is valuable to me." Emily felt something disarming inside her, like a knot that finally unravels after being tensed for too long. "I'm not used to people valuing what I do," she admitted. "My father always supported my art, but for him it was a hobby, something that complemented my serious studies." Jack set the glass on the table and approached her. With a surprisingly tender gesture, he brushed a lock of hair from her face. "It's not a hobby, Emily, it's a gift. You see things that the rest of us don't see, And you express them in a way that makes us feel understood, I suppose. He looked at her with an intensity that made Emily's heart accelerate. When I saw the painting where you represent me carrying the house but with orange trees flowering on my shoulders, it was as if someone finally understood what my life has been. A constant weight, yes, but also the capacity to create something beautiful despite it. Emily didn't know what to respond. Words seemed inadequate to express what she felt in that moment. Instead, she took a step forward and, for the first time since they had known each other, it was she who initiated the contact, gently resting her head against Jack's chest. He remained immobile for an instant, as if he didn't know how to react to this gesture so simple, yet so intimate. Then slowly his arms closed around her in a tentative embrace that gained firmness. They remained like this in silence, while the fire crackled in the fireplace and the rain gently beat against the windows of the library. Words weren't necessary. In that moment, the language they shared went beyond verbal conventions. It was the universal language of art, which Emily had captured in her canvases and which Jack, against all odds, had learned to read. The night New York disappeared under the first tropical rain of winter, Jack and Emily found themselves trapped in the mansion by a storm that paralyzed the city. The wind whipped the wooden blinds and made the century-old beams creak, while the rain silently accumulated on the roofs and gardens. Seated before the lit fireplace in the main salon, wrapped in an intimacy imposed by the circumstances, something definitely changed between them. Perhaps it was the reserve wine they shared. Perhaps the vulnerability generated by feeling isolated from the outside world. Or perhaps it was simply that the inevitable moment had arrived when two people who have been orbiting around each other finally meet on the same plane. "I never asked you why you really accepted this marriage," Jack said, breaking a comfortable silence that had settled between them. "I know it was for your father's operation, but I could have looked for other solutions," she completed, contemplating how the flames projected dancing shadows on his angular face. "I know." Emily reflected for a moment before responding, seeking the honesty that Jack deserved. "At the beginning, it was purely pragmatic. My father needed that operation or he would die. We didn't have the money, not even by mortgaging the apartment where we lived. And then you appeared like an implausible solution to all our problems." She paused to take a sip of wine. "But there was something more. When you proposed marriage, I saw in your eyes something that I recognized, because I saw it every morning in the mirror. Loneliness. A deep-rooted loneliness, the kind that isn't cured simply by being surrounded by people." Jack observed her in silence, his face unusually expressive in the changing light of the fire. "And I thought that perhaps, just perhaps, two solitudes together might be less lonely," she concluded with a slight smile. The silence that followed was loaded with meaning. Jack slowly rotated the glass between his fingers, contemplating the ruby liquid as if it contained answers. "Every person I've loved has abandoned me," he finally said, with a voice so low that Emily could barely hear him over the crackling of the fire. "My mother died when I was 12 years old. My father, though physically present, lost himself in work and alcohol. Catherine left taking my son, and each time I built walls higher, thicker." He passed a hand over his face in a gesture that combined weariness and vulnerability. "When I saw you for the first time at the New York Public Library, reading to those elderly people who went there more for human company than for the books, I saw something different. A natural kindness, without pretensions. And then when we coincided at the hospital, it wasn't a coincidence," Emily noted softly, without reproach in her voice. "No," he admitted. "I had been observing you for months, from a distance. I knew about your father's illness, your economic difficulties. And yes, I needed a wife to comply with my father's will, but I could have found less complicated candidates." "Complicated?" Emily arched an eyebrow. A fleeting smile crossed Jack's face. "Independent, intelligent, capable of seeing through appearances. The type of woman who wouldn't conform to being a silent ornament in an old house." The sincerity of his words touched something deep in Emily. For months, she had wondered why he, able to choose among women of high society, who would perfectly understand the rules of the game, had chosen her, a young woman without connections or fortune. "And still you chose me." "Because I didn't believe someone like you could choose me freely," he confessed, looking her directly in the eyes. "Not with the age difference. Not with the emotional baggage I carry, not with a disappeared son whom I still search for. So I created a situation where it seemed I was doing you a favor, when in reality, it was you who was seeking to be saved," she completed, finally understanding the complex dynamic that had given rise to their relationship. Jack nodded, lowering his gaze to the fire. "And now I'm terrified," he admitted, with a vulnerability Emily had never seen in him, "because I'm beginning to feel things that I promised myself never to feel again. And I don't know if I would survive losing you too." The words floated between them, as fragile and at the same time as powerful as raindrops against the window panes. Emily felt something expanding in her chest, a warmth that contrasted with the cold that lashed New York that night. She rose from her armchair and approached Jack's. Slowly, like someone approaching a wounded animal that might flee or attack, she knelt before him and took his face between her hands, feeling the roughness of the incipient beard under her fingers. "Then let me show you that some loves stay," she said, with a conviction that was born from the deepest part of her being. And for the first time since they had known each other, it was she who initiated the kiss. A tentative kiss at first, which gained intensity as Jack responded, as if both were learning a new language, one made of gestures and sighs instead of words. When they finally separated, Emily saw something in Jack's eyes that had never been there before: hope, a vulnerable, trembling hope, like a newly lit flame that any wind could extinguish, but hope nonetheless. That night, while the storm roared outside and the rain continued to fall silently on New York, transforming the city into a magical and unknown version of itself, Jack and Emily discovered that the walls they had built around their hearts weren't as impenetrable as they had believed, and that perhaps, just perhaps, true love didn't consist of finding someone perfect, but in learning to perfectly see the imperfections of another person. Spring arrived in New York with an explosion of color and aroma that seemed to reflect the transformation that was taking place inside the Morgan mansion. After the wettest winter that the city remembered in decades, the cherry trees in the interior garden blossomed with a vigor that surprised even Johnson, the old gardener who had seen more springs pass than most. Emily observed the changes not only in nature, but also in the dynamics of the house that now she truly felt as her own. The rooms that before had seemed cold and distant were coming to life. There were open books on small tables that before only held untouchable ornaments, fresh flowers in vases that had been empty for years, American music sounding in rooms that had remained in silence. But the most significant change was the one that had taken place in her relationship with Jack. Since that night of the storm, a new intimacy had established itself between them. It wasn't just physical, though that aspect had also blossomed with an intensity that sometimes surprised them both. It was an emotional closeness, a complicity based on mutual knowledge that went beyond social conventions or matrimonial expectations. One particularly luminous morning, while they breakfasted together on the terrace that overlooked the interior garden, Emily gathered the courage to propose an idea that had been gestating in her mind for weeks. "I've been thinking about the third floor," she said, carefully observing Jack's reaction. He set his coffee cup on the saucer with a controlled movement. His eyes, which Emily could now read with increasing ease, showed a flash of uneasiness. "What have you been thinking?" he asked cautiously. "I think we could transform it into something new," she responded, choosing each word with care. Not erasing what it was, but giving it a different purpose. Jack remained silent, inviting her to continue. "We could convert it into a children's library for underprivileged kids from Greenwich Village and Harlem," she proposed, finally revealing the idea she had been maturing. "We would keep some original pieces as a homage to Michael wherever he may be, but we would fill the space with new life, with purpose." She expected resistance, perhaps even rejection. Instead, she saw how Jack's eyes filled with contained tears. "You would do that?" he asked with a hoarse voice. "Help me transform that space that has been closed for so long?" Emily extended her hand across the table and took his. "I think it's time to open doors, not just rooms." The following days were ones of intense activity. Jack hired architects to adapt the space while maintaining its essence, while Emily contacted neighborhood associations and librarians to better understand the needs of the children they wanted to serve. Together, they selected which original elements to conserve: the crystal mobile that would now hang over the reading area, the shelves that would be repainted in vibrant colors, some of the most special children's books that would be integrated into the collection. The process proved therapeutic for both, especially for Jack. Emily observed how day by day his expression softened, as if each decision about what to preserve and what to transform was also a decision about his own past, honoring it without remaining trapped in it. One afternoon, while they were reviewing plans with the architect in the dining room, the news arrived that would change everything. The private investigators that Jack maintained searching for Catherine and Michael had found a solid lead. Someone who matched Catherine's description had been seen in Toronto working as an English teacher in an international school. Jack's reaction was complex. Emily saw in his eyes a mixture of hope, fear, and something deeper. Uncertainty about what this possible reunion would mean for his current life, for what they were building together. "You should go," Emily said that night, while they shared a quiet moment in the library. "To Toronto to check if it really is them." Jack looked at her with intensity. "And if it is?" he asked, verbalizing the fear that floated between them. Emily breathed deeply before responding. "Then you'll have the opportunity to meet your son, to explain to Catherine what really happened, to close a chapter that has remained open for too long. And us?" The vulnerability in his voice made Emily feel a pressure in her chest. "We will still be here," she responded with a conviction she didn't even know she possessed. "What we've built doesn't depend on ghosts from the past, Jack. It depends on what we choose to be for each other each day." 2 weeks later, Jack flew to Toronto while Emily supervised the final details of the children's library. The opening was planned for the following month, coinciding with Children's Day, and 1,000 details remained to be finalized. It was during these days of absence that Emily discovered something that would irrevocably change the course of their lives. She was pregnant. The news, confirmed by a gynecologist at the exclusive Mount Sinai Hospital, left her in a state of happy days. A baby, a new life growing inside her, fruit of a love that had blossomed in the most improbable terrain. She decided not to tell Jack by phone. This news deserved to be shared face to face when he returned from his trip with the answers he sought, whatever they might be. Jack returned from Canada a week later, his face marked by a strange mixture of emotions. He had found Catherine, indeed. She lived in Toronto with a Canadian architect, and they had 2 young daughters, but Michael wasn't with them. "The baby died 3 days after birth," Jack explained that night, his voice breaking as he pronounced the words. "Catherine never told me. She left the hospital alone, devastated, blaming me and my lies for the stress that had precipitated the labor and the subsequent complications." Emily felt tears running down her cheeks as she listened, imagining the immense pain, the guilt, the ghost of what could have been. "All these years," Jack continued, looking into the void, "I've been searching for a child who never grew up, who never had the opportunity to play with the toys I bought, to read the books I collected. I've been chasing a ghost." "I'm so sorry," Emily murmured, holding him in her arms, feeling how Jack's body trembled with silent sobs. She cried with him that night, for the son he never knew, for the years lost in guilt and recriminations, for all the what-ifs that had poisoned his existence. And when finally the crying subsided, when the emotional storm gave way to an exhausted calm, Emily took his face between her hands and gave him the news. "I'm pregnant." Jack's eyes, reddened from crying, opened with amazement. He took several seconds to process what he had just heard. "A baby?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We're going to have a baby?" Emily nodded, unable to contain the smile that illuminated her face. "We're going to have a baby." Jack remained immobile for what seemed like an eternity. Then slowly, he placed a trembling hand on Emily's still flat belly. "You've given me back something I thought I had lost forever," he said with a breaking voice, "the capacity to have hope." That night, embraced in the bed they now shared without reservations, they made plans that neither would have imagined possible a year ago. They talked about names, about how to adapt one of the empty rooms as a nursery for the baby, about how they would balance family life with their respective passions, the vineyards, the painting. And at some point, while the full moon bathed the room with its silvery light, Emily understood that what had begun as a pragmatic agreement between 2 strangers had transformed, against all odds, into the only thing that truly matters in the end: a family. Not one defined by social conventionalism or external expectations, but one built day by day, with effort, honesty, and the will to see the other as they are, with all their lights and shadows. News of the pregnancy transformed the mansion as if a current of fresh air had swept away years of accumulated melancholy. Jack, who had always maintained a certain reserve even in his closest moments, now showed an almost childlike enthusiasm before the preparations for the baby's arrival. One October morning, as they breakfasted in the garden under the shade of a flowering cherry tree, which perfumed the air with that sweet and penetrating aroma so typical of the New York spring, Jack surprised Emily with an unexpected proposal. "I think we should move." Emily looked at him disconcertedly, her cup of lemon balm tea suspended halfway to her lips. "Move? Why?" "This mansion has been the Morgan family home for generations." Jack contemplated the garden with a thoughtful expression before responding. "Precisely because of that. This place is too loaded with history, with expectations, with ghosts." He paused, carefully choosing his words. "I want our child to grow up in a home that we build together, not in one where you arrived as a guest who slowly earned the right to belong." Emily set the cup on the porcelain saucer, absorbing the proposal. There was something profoundly symbolic in what Jack was suggesting. A new beginning, free from the shadows of the past. "And where would we go?" she asked, allowing herself to imagine the possibilities. Jack's smile widened. "I've been thinking about Napa Valley. Not the manor house next to the wineries, but a piece of land I bought years ago in the hills, with views of the valley. We could design our own house, something contemporary, but with roots, with lots of light for your painting and space for the little one to run freely." The idea began to take root in Emily's imagination. A house in the country, surrounded by vineyards, far from the New York bustle and the social pressures of the city. "And the children's library we're creating here?" she asked, thinking of the project that meant so much to both of them. "It would continue functioning exactly the same," he responded. "In fact, we could expand it, dedicate more of the mansion's space to social projects. We would convert this place into something alive and useful, instead of a mausoleum of memories." As Jack spoke, Emily noticed something different in him, a lightness, as if he had let fall an invisible weight he had carried for years. "You've changed," she observed softly. "A few months ago, the idea of leaving this mansion, of transforming it so radically, would have seemed unthinkable to you." Jack took her hand across the table. "You've changed me," he responded with a disarming honesty. "You've taught me that preserving the past doesn't mean being trapped in it, that honoring roots doesn't prevent growing in new directions." That afternoon they toured the mansion together, but this time with new eyes. Not as owners protecting a property, but as temporary guardians of a space with potential to serve many. They devised plans to convert more rooms into useful spaces, an art room for young talents without resources, a training center for single mothers, a meeting point for lonely elderly people from the neighborhood. As they planned these transformations, Emily felt growing within her not only the baby, but also an increasingly solid certainty. What had begun as a marriage of convenience had become a partnership in the best sense of the word. An alliance between two people who complemented each other, who saw possibilities where others saw limitations, who built bridges where before there had been walls. Spring advanced, and with it, Emily's pregnancy. Her body changed day by day, and Jack observed these transformations with a mixture of amazement and reverence that deeply moved her. He, who had always maintained a certain physical distance, even in their most intimate moments, now seemed incapable of staying away, a hand always seeking contact with her growing belly, eyes that followed her through the rooms with an expression of wonder she had never seen in them. One night, while they were reviewing plans for the Napa Valley house in the office, Emily felt the baby's first kick, a small but unmistakable movement, like the fluttering of a butterfly inside her. "Jack!" she exclaimed, bringing her hand to her belly. "It moved!" In seconds he was kneeling before her, his hands delicately placed on the curve of her pregnancy, waiting with an expectant expression. When the baby moved again, more strongly this time, Jack's face transformed with an emotion so pure, so unprotected, that Emily felt she fell completely in love with him at that precise instant. "It's real," he murmured, his voice broken by emotion. "All this time I knew you were pregnant, but now I can feel it. It's real." Emily placed a hand over his, intertwining their fingers. "It's real," she confirmed softly. "And it's healthy and strong, and it's waiting for us to meet it." That night, in the intimacy of their bedroom, Jack confessed to her a fear he had been harboring since he learned of the pregnancy. "I'm terrified of not being a good father," he admitted, as he distractedly caressed Emily's hair. "My own father was distant, demanding, incapable of showing affection. And then with Michael, I didn't even have the opportunity to try. What if I don't know how to do it?" Emily rose up on an elbow to look him directly in the eyes. "Remember what you told me when you bought all my paintings? That you wanted to live surrounded by my vision of the world because it helped you see yourself in a different way." Jack nodded, not understanding where she was going with this. "Well, here's my vision. I see you as a man who has learned from his mistakes, who has found the courage to be vulnerable, who knows that love is not possession but shared freedom. Those are exactly the ingredients to be a wonderful father." The following weeks passed in a frenzy of activity. As Emily's belly grew, so did their shared projects. The children's library on the 3rd floor was almost ready for its opening. The plans for the Napa Valley house were advancing rapidly, and they had even begun to design a line of organic wines that would finance educational programs for the children of immigrant workers in the vineyards. Life, which for so long had seemed stagnant for both, he trapped in guilt and remorse, she limited by economic circumstances and others' expectations, now flowed with a renewed energy, like a river that finally finds its natural course after years diverted by artificial obstacles. It was in this moment of fulfillment that the news arrived which a year before would have been devastating, but which now fell on fertile ground. Sarah's lawyers had presented a lawsuit questioning the validity of Jack and Emily's marriage, alleging that it had been a fraudulent agreement designed solely to comply with the testamentary clause of the father. The morning they received the notification, Emily expected to see in Jack the familiar tension, the hardening of features that had always characterized his moments of stress. Instead, he surprised her by laughing as he read the legal document. "What's so funny?" she asked, disconcerted by his reaction. "Sarah is trying to take control of the wineries from you." Jack set the papers on the table and looked at her with a serenity that Emily had never seen in him when it came to matters related to his sister. "What's funny is that I no longer care," he responded, approaching to embrace her. "If tomorrow I lost the entire Morgan empire, all the vineyards and all the wineries, I would still have the only thing that really matters to me, you and our child." That afternoon, as the sun began to set behind the skyscrapers of New York, tinting the sky with intense purples and oranges, Jack and Emily strolled through Central Park. It had been his idea. "I want the last image our child has of New York from inside your womb to be beautiful," he had said. Seated by the lake, watching how the last rays of sun reflected in the water, Jack took Emily's hands in his. "There's something I've never explicitly told you," he began, with a solemnity that contrasted with the lightness he had shown that morning. "Something you probably already know, but that deserves to be said aloud." Emily looked at him expectant. "I love you, Emily Wilson," he said simply. "Not out of convenience, not for the baby you carry inside, not for how you've transformed the mansion or my vision of the world. I love you for who you are. Brave, honest, capable of seeing beauty where others only see routine. And I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." The words, so simple and at the same time so profound, floated between them like the golden leaves that fell from the nearby trees, rocked by the soft spring breeze. And Emily knew with a certainty that was born from the deepest part of her being that what had begun as an agreement of convenience had blossomed into something much more beautiful and lasting than any legal contract. "I love you too," she responded, feeling that the words, though insufficient, were necessary. "And there's nothing you need to do to deserve me. You chose me when you could have chosen anyone. You saw me when I was invisible to the rest of the world. That is merit enough for a lifetime." That night, as they returned to the mansion under a starry sky, Emily felt a strange but pleasant sensation of closure, as if a chapter of her life were concluding just as another, more luminous and promising, began to be written. And though she couldn't see it, inside her womb little hope, for that's what they had decided to call her if she was a girl, gave a vigorous kick, as if wanting to remind them that the future, with all its possibilities, was already on its way. The 7th month of pregnancy found Emily and Jack in full transformation of their lives. The children's library on the 3rd floor had been inaugurated with great success during Children's Day, filling with laughs and childish voices a space that for too long had remained sealed in silence. Children from Greenwich Village and Harlem, many of them children of immigrants who had never set foot in the elegant Upper East Side neighborhood, now ran through the marble corridors of the mansion, chose books from shelves that before only accumulated dust, and participated in reading and art workshops organized by university volunteers. Jack observed all this with a mixture of amazement and satisfaction that Emily had never seen in him. During one of the storytelling sessions, while a young Latino volunteer read The Little Prince adapted for children, Emily caught him with silent tears sliding down his cheeks. "What's wrong?" she asked in a whisper, concerned. Jack shook his head, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it sounded hoarse with emotion. "I'm thinking about my father," he confessed, "about how proud he would be to see how we're using the family fortune. He who came to America with nothing, who knew hunger and disdain, who worked until he bled to build something, would see these children and understand that this is the true Morgan legacy, not the vineyards or the wineries, but the opportunities." Emily squeezed his hand, moved by this new facet of Jack that she continued to discover, his capacity to connect with his deepest roots and find in them not limitations, but inspiration. Meanwhile, the preparations for their new life advanced at a good pace. The architects had presented the definitive plans for the house in Napa Valley, a contemporary but warm design with large windows that framed the spectacular views of the valley, open spaces that invited conviviality, and a painting studio for Emily oriented to the north to capture the perfect light throughout the day. For its part, Sarah's lawsuit had turned out to be less threatening than they initially feared. The judge, after examining the documentation presented by Jack's lawyers, which included proof of Emily's pregnancy and testimonies from people who had witnessed the genuine evolution of their relationship, had dismissed the accusations of fraudulent marriage. Sarah, frustrated but not defeated, had returned to Los Angeles, where rumors suggested she was considering entering a rehabilitation center to treat her gambling addiction. Life, which for so long had been for Jack an exercise in containment and control, now flowed with a freedom that visibly rejuvenated him. Emily observed him interact with the world in ways that months ago would have been unthinkable, chatting animatedly with the parents of the children who visited the library, learning words in Spanish and Mandarin from the Latino and Asian immigrants who worked in the new organic plantations of the vineyards, even laughing openly during family meals with Frank, who had become a frequent visitor to the mansion. It was precisely during one of these meals when Jack surprised everyone with an unexpected announcement. "I've decided to create a foundation," he declared as he served a special wine that he had personally brought from Napa Valley. "The Hope Catherine Morgan Foundation." Emily looked at him, surprised both by the announcement and by the chosen name, which combined what they had chosen for their daughter with that of Jack's first wife. "The foundation will have two main objectives," he continued, animated by the interest in the eyes of his wife and father-in-law. "First, to provide quality education to the children of agricultural workers, not just in our vineyards, but in the entire American wine industry. And second, to finance medical research on premature births and their complications." Frank, who since his operation had recovered the color and vitality that Emily remembered from her childhood, nodded with approval. "That's closing the circle, Jack, honoring the past while building the future." That night, while they prepared the room for the baby, a luminous chamber with views of the interior garden, Emily reflected on the transformation that both had experienced. She, who had entered that mansion as a stranger, now felt it as her own, not by legal right, but by the love she had invested in every corner. And Jack, who had lived surrounded by invisible walls built with pain and regret, now opened windows to a future that he didn't even know he could desire. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, interrupting her reflections as he placed a mobile of silver stars above the white crib, so similar, and at the same time so different from the one that had remained immobile for years in the sealed room on the third floor. "About how people change," Emily responded, caressing her prominent belly where little Hope performed increasingly vigorous somersaults. "About how we've gone from being two strangers, united by a contract, to being this. A family, a team." Jack left what he was doing and approached her. With a tenderness that still surprised her, he placed his hands on her belly, as he constantly did now, marveled by each movement of his daughter. "Do you know what my father told me once, shortly before dying?" he asked, with his gaze lost in memories. "He told me, Jack, there are two things you must give your children: roots to grow strong and wings to fly far." At that moment, I didn't understand. I thought he was referring literally to the material inheritance, to ensuring they had economic stability, but also independence. He paused, searching for the exact words. Now I understand that he was talking about something deeper. Roots are values, identity, the sense of belonging, and wings are the freedom to define their own path, to make mistakes and learn from them, to build something new that perhaps we can't even imagine. Emily nodded, moved by the depth of the reflection. "It's beautiful, Jack, and it's exactly what I want for our daughter." She was about to continue when a sharp pain made her double over suddenly, holding her belly. Jack held her, alarmed, while a second spasm stronger than the first made her groan. "Emily? What's happening?" She looked at him with eyes dilated by the sudden fear. "I think they're contractions," she responded, feeling how a warm liquid began to descend her legs. "But it's too early. I'm barely 7 months along." Jack's face visibly paled, and Emily knew he was reliving the trauma of Michael's premature birth. But then, something changed in his expression. The anguish gave way to an iron determination. "We're going to the hospital," he said with a firm but serene voice. "Everything is going to be fine, Emily. This time it will be different. This time we're together." The following hours passed in a nebula of pain, fear, and hope. Mount Sinai Hospital, where Emily was urgently admitted, became the epicenter of what Jack would later describe as the longest hours of his life. Each minute stretched like an eternity as the doctors tried to stop the premature birth, administering medications to mature the baby's lungs in case it proved impossible to retain it longer. Jack didn't separate from Emily for a moment. He held her hand with an almost painful strength during each contraction, murmuring words of encouragement and, when he thought she couldn't hear him, prayers whispered in Italian, the maternal language that his parents spoke at home and that he had never mentioned knowing. "What are you saying?" Emily asked during a brief respite between contractions. Jack seemed embarrassed for a moment. "It's a prayer that my mother taught us," he admitted, "to Our Lady of the Destitute." "It's silly, I know, but—" "It's not silly," Emily interrupted him, squeezing his hand. "It's beautiful. It's part of your roots." As the hours passed, Jack's fear was palpable. The prematurity, the memories of Michael's birth years ago, the terror that history might repeat itself. But this time everything was different. Despite the medical efforts to stop the birth, Hope Catherine Morgan Wilson decided it was time to meet the world. She arrived in an explosion of sound and movement, small but surprisingly strong, with lungs that announced her presence with a vigorous cry that filled the delivery room. And when they placed her on Emily's chest, wrapped in a thermal blanket, with her wrinkled little face and her dark down crowning a perfect head, both knew that nothing would ever be the same. "She's perfect," Jack whispered, with tears flowing freely down his face as he caressed with a trembling finger the tiny hand of his daughter. Perfect and strong, like her mother. The following days were of constant vigil. Hope, born 5 weeks early, needed to remain in the incubator, connected to monitors that registered each beat of her small heart. Jack and Emily established shifts to not leave her alone for a moment, reading her stories, singing her lullabies, ensuring that, despite the tubes and machines, she knew she was surrounded by love. And with each day that passed, with each gram that Hope gained, with each small milestone she reached, breathing without assistance, regulating her temperature, beginning to nurse, the shadow of the past that had pursued Jack for so long was vanishing, replaced by the bright light of a present that, against all odds, had become more beautiful than he had ever dared to dream. It was during one of those long nights in the hospital, as they observed Hope sleeping peacefully in her incubator, when Emily understood the magnitude of the gift that life had given them, not just a daughter, but a second chance. The opportunity to heal old wounds, to build something new on solid foundations, to transform an agreement of convenience into the type of love that romance novels try to capture, but rarely manage to describe in all its complex beauty. "You know what?" Jack said in a low voice without taking his eyes off his daughter. "I think I finally understand what my mother used to say." "What did she say?" Emily asked, intertwining her fingers with his. That the true miracle isn't finding perfect love, but learning to perfectly see the imperfections of real love. And as Hope slept, oblivious to the profound moment of revelation that her parents shared, the last piece of the puzzle seemed to fit into place, completing a picture that, although different from what either of them had initially imagined, was infinitely more beautiful in its imperfect authenticity. 2 years later, under the clear sky of Napa Valley tinted by the last rays of the sunset, Emily contemplated from the terrace of their new house the spectacle of colors that bathed the vineyards. The valley extended before her like a living painting, precise rows of vines loaded with ripe grapes, the river winding in the distance like a silver ribbon, and in the background, the mountains that changed tonality with each passing minute. The house, as they had planned, was a harmonious mixture of tradition and modernity. Walls of local stone combined with enormous windows, open spaces that invited conviviality and intimate corners for solitary reflection. Emily's studio, oriented to the north to capture the perfect light, had become the creative heart of the home, with canvases in various states of completion that documented her evolution as an artist. From the distance came to her the laughter of Hope, clear and musical, followed by Jack's grave voice telling her some invented story. At her just completed 2 years of age, the girl was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, with her father's dark hair and Emily's expressive eyes. They had overcome the scare of her premature birth with flying colors. Hope had turned out to be not only physically strong, but also emotionally, with a resilience that seemed to reflect the history of her parents. Emily smiled, remembering the path traveled from that first night in the New York mansion to this moment of fulfillment in Napa Valley. The mansion was still theirs, but they had completely transformed it. Besides the children's library, it now housed a cultural center managed by the Hope Catherine Morgan Foundation, which offered workshops in art, music, and literature to people of all ages and social conditions. Sarah, to everyone's surprise, had found her own path to redemption. After completing a rehabilitation program for her gambling addiction, she had asked to participate in the foundation. She currently directed a program of micro-credits for entrepreneurial women, channeling her intelligence and energy into something constructive for the first time in her life. Her relationship with Jack, though it would never be completely fluid, had transformed into a mutual respect that neither had believed possible. And Frank, Emily's father, enjoyed a second youth dividing his time between New York and Napa Valley. He had become a devoted grandfather who spoiled Hope with endless stories about American history, and an unexpected friend for Jack, with whom he shared long conversations about literature, politics, and philosophy that often extended into the early morning hours. Emily's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Jack and Hope. The girl ran to her with outstretched arms, her cheeks rosy from play and fresh air. "Mommy! Daddy says shooting stars will come tonight." Emily lifted her in her arms, marveling as always at the solid and warm weight of her daughter, at the vibrant life that emanated from every inch of her small body. "It's true, my love. There's a meteor shower tonight. And if you make a wish when you see one, they say it comes true." Hope's eyes opened with amazement at this information. "Really?" "Well," Jack intervened, joining them and placing an arm around Emily's waist. "Let's say that the stars help us remember what we really wish for, and when we remember it with sufficient clarity, we find a way to make it real." Emily smiled at him, recognizing in his words the wisdom he had acquired over these years. Jack was no longer the hermetic and controlling man she had met. He remained intense, sometimes too serious, and occasionally withdrew into himself when memories of Michael assaulted him on anniversaries or significant dates. But he had learned to share these moments instead of hiding them, to allow Emily to accompany him in pain as in joy. That night, after settling Hope, who had fallen asleep on the terrace waiting for the shooting stars, exhausted by a day full of adventures, Emily and Jack sat in the small viewpoint they had built at the top of the hill, with a bottle of wine from their own vintage and blankets, to protect themselves from the cool of the Californian night. "Do you know what day it is today?" Jack asked, serving the wine in fine crystal glasses that captured and reflected the light of the full moon. Emily looked at him, intrigued. "It's September 24th. Should I remember something special?" Jack smiled, that gesture that even after so long made Emily's heart speed up slightly. Exactly 3 years ago, a young woman named Emily Wilson entered the Morgan mansion for the first time. trembling not from fear, but from the intensity of a gaze that promised unknown worlds. Emily felt a warmth expand in her chest as she remembered that first night, so distant and at the same time so present. "The jasmine candles," she murmured. "The white lace dress on the velvet armchair. And my words, 'Trust me, I'll go slowly,'" Jack completed, intertwining his fingers with hers. Words that proved prophetic, although not in the way I imagined then. They remained silent for a moment, contemplating the star-speckled sky that over Napa Valley seemed brighter and more numerous than in any other place they had known. "If someone had told me then where we would be today," Jack continued, his voice tinged with amazement, "I would have thought they were crazy. A real marriage born from an agreement of convenience, a daughter who has healed wounds I believed eternal, a life that for the first time feels complete." Emily rested her head on his shoulder, absorbing the warmth of his body in the cool night. "Do you know what's most extraordinary?" she reflected. "That we built it step by step, day by day. It wasn't a lightning bolt that fell from the sky or an instantaneous arrow like in fairy tales. It was a constant choice, choosing to trust when fear advised the contrary, choosing to forgive when pride demanded vengeance, choosing to believe in the other even when we doubted ourselves." Jack nodded, gently squeezing her hand. "My father used to say that the most exceptional wine doesn't arise from perfect conditions, but from vines that have had to struggle. Against droughts, against early frosts, against rocky soils. That struggle," he said, "is what gives depth and character to the wine." "Like our love," Emily completed, perfectly understanding the metaphor. "Born from improbable circumstances, strengthened by challenges, and now mature at its best moment." A shooting star crossed the sky at that instant, leaving behind it a luminous trail that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Both followed it with their gaze, sharing a silent wish they didn't need to verbalize because they were already living it. "What do you think will happen in the next 3 years?" Emily asked, contemplating the horizon where the last vineyards were lost in the darkness of the night. Jack reflected for a moment before responding, "I don't know, and that's what's wonderful. For the first time in my life, I don't need to control each variable, to foresee each contingency. I can simply live, with you, with hope, with what comes." He turned to her, taking her face between his hands with a delicacy that contrasted with the strength of his words. "I only know one thing with certainty. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Because what we've built isn't fragile like crystal, but strong like the stone of this land. It can withstand storms, droughts, even earthquakes, because its foundations are rooted in something deeper than a contract or a convenience. They are rooted in a choice renewed each day, in a trust earned step by step, in a love that grew not despite the difficulties but through them." Emily felt her eyes filling with tears, not of sadness but of that complex emotion that arises when happiness is so intense it almost hurts. Because at that moment, under the starry sky of Napa Valley, surrounded by the vines that had seen generations of Morgans pass, she understood that they had completed a perfect circle. What began as a calculated transaction had transformed into the most precious and unexpected gift that life could offer. "Sometimes," she murmured as Jack dried a tear from her cheek with his thumb, "the most improbable paths lead us exactly where we needed to be, though we didn't know it." And as the night advanced and more shooting stars crossed the firmament above them, Emily and Jack remained entwined at that viewpoint, not as the inexperienced young woman and the controlling businessman they had been, but as two people who had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that true love doesn't consist of finding someone perfect, but in learning to perfectly see the imperfections of another person, and choosing day after day to stay by their side, not out of obligation, but out of desire, not out of convenience, but out of conviction. Somewhere in the house, Hope slept peacefully, perhaps dreaming of shooting stars and wishes that come true, and in her small body, in each beat of her vigorous heart, throbbed the promise of the future, a future that her parents had built not from a predetermined plan, but through that mysterious alchemy that transforms the ordinary into extraordinary, the pragmatic into passionate, the convenient into essential. Sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most necessary destinations. Emily had thought that first night in the mansion, and now, 3 years later, she knew that it hadn't been just a thought but a premonition, the story of her life with Jack, a story that would continue to be written not with ink on paper, but with daily decisions, with shared laughter, with occasional tears, and with that tranquil but indestructible love that flourishes beyond fairy tales, in the fertile but imperfect terrain of real life.